Philosophers talk to our times, towards a complex ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. I hope it goes without saying we're all fantasists. Or at least I think we all are. But the fate of fantasists are radically different. By and large, there's a fair, straight correlation. The richer and paler you are, the more your fantasies are indulged. And the more the fantasies are indulged, the more you think they must be true. And the more you think they must be true, the greater the fantasies go. I kind of think it's always worth remembering that. Because one of the effects, though, of technology, one of the promises, I think, of technology, is it democratizes, no, communizes fantasy. It opens up the possibility that groups that were traditionally not allowed to be fantasists can express their fantasy and demand it has some kind of reality. And this is a very complex and always a very dangerous thing. First of all, before I start, I'm about to be rather rude about fantasists. I've had my life rammed too often against realism to have an awful lot of patience. Except I am very aware that, like everybody else, a large chunk of my mind is just dreams. It's just me thinking about it, hoping for it to be true, wondering if it could be true. But I tend to get very pragmatic very quickly about its possibility. And so it's how you stay not being bound over, caught up in dreams. Now, this is, of course, not true for people normally of my class or caste or whatever, and those wealthier. They can always live the fantasy. Easy peasy. And the entire system was always designed for white, rich mediocrities to rise to the top and be able to talk about things as if they were very good. It didn't matter they were idiots who climbed into fridges to avoid reporters, or catering trucks to involve a fantasy of bombs. It didn't matter then that they were screaming cowards who wanted always others to die, or would always take others' money. It's one of the things about the fantasists, the rich fantasists, I mean. They're very liberal with other people's money. They accuse socialism of being it, but of course it's not true, it's just projection. They're the ones who are very liberal with everybody else's money, but quite careful with their own. Look at Brexit and the way that it squandered a nation's wealth, but allowed those people who are organising it to quietly save theirs, and likewise as they saved their citizenship, and so didn't have to just become British. There was always then a way, not only the system rewarded fantasists, but it also never called out the hypocrisy as long as they were wealthy enough. And for my money. Now, I'm about to be very rude about universities, okay? I really am. But I want to just say before I am rude about them, there are very many very good teachers in universities. I've got many friends who are in university and are epically great teachers and also good researchers. But my experience of universities is they are chock-a-block with white professors whose best and glory days was always in the past and never could teach anyway, but were very good at promising stuff, very good at opening up the possibility for stuff that strangely was never done. Being a fantasist then was caught up actually with the job. You wanted to express a fantasy of what the department could look like. My father, bless him, was an epically good teacher. His subject, I don't know if I mentioned it before, was electrical engineering. All Fourier transforms and really quite complicated maths. And he was in charge of the maths department. His maths wasn't brilliant, but hey, whatever. But what he was brilliant at doing was taking kids who had often been abandoned by the system So these were kids from Afro-Caribbean extraction in urban London, and getting them good quality electrical engineering degrees. It goes without saying, because he didn't used to play the fantasy game, he was never promoted, like ever. He spent his entire life as a junior lecturer. He didn't need to be promoted, so he didn't particularly up the fantasy. It wasn't his fantasy to be a professor in a university. But my point was, because it wasn't his fantasy, and he didn't play any of the rules for that fantasy, because there are rules in the fantasy, he literally never got promoted for all of his skill as a teacher. And again, my experience in other universities is that various professors, what you never do is run through their you don't check them for plagiarism, because you don't want to know. And I've known 2 or 3 like that. You get what I'm talking about here. That being a fantasist is actually normal for a certain group in society. I mean, Johnson was a pure fantasist. That would be the kindest way of calling it. Fantasists often these days get called narcissists, and he probably was a narcissist. But there is something I would probably think slightly different between a fantasist and a narcissist. Fantasist is what we all are. We all just make up truth and hope that it will become true. And I needn't say anything about Trump, because you all can see it. I mean, he's a thick, very privileged fantasist. I think I'll just stay there. And it all just becomes a fantasy that people demand. And traditionally, heaven help you, if you're in one of those groups, if you want to look at what racism looks like, in a sense, that is it. If you're in one of those groups that are not allowed to be fantasists by society, that somehow needs to be, they're part of the slave classes. They ought to be up against the truth of things, up against the reality of things. Then society is very, very, very hard on you. The recent suicide of a Cambridge professor, Jason Hardy, it's a classic example. Yes, he was a fantasist, and yes, his lies were extreme, if lies they be. They were just personal fantasy that people were believing. And why not? But he didn't come from that group that quite had the normal set of rules for fantasists. And because of his skin colour, and it was exactly that, he annoyed those groups of people. He annoyed those who were used to their privilege not being their privilege alone. I think I'm going to put it that way. And so his fantasies were exposed. And he went the way that all fantasists go when they're exposed. He climbed into a shell and died, and committed suicide. The sin was being found out, of course. The sin was being one of those groups of people who were traditionally not allowed to have their fantasies. And yet, it is also the case that beyond that extreme example, the contours of fantasism is clearly moving. I mean, what else is AI selling but the idea that we can all have our set of fantasies? We can all just dream it and it is true. It is the ultimate communist utopia, the one that Marx was very careful to never define. His communist was rather learned and capable of being both a bricklayer and a critique. But the normal kind of utopian, dystopian fantasist is always caught up in having exactly what they want. And as I always think, it's a difficult and dangerous thing to be a fantasist. It's one of those things about modernity that makes me go, oh, that's not going to work then, is it? Really. It's difficult and dangerous because sooner or later, as you are a fantasist, you either have to distort all reality in the direction of your fantasy, and at some point, if nothing else, physics intervenes because it doesn't give two blind whatevers about your fantasy. Or you will come a cropper against actual reality that is much harder and nastier than your fantasy will ever be. And that will often happen. And yet, and I mean, I said, and traditionally, that has happened to those groups who were not in the ruling set. But now we are all encouraged to have more fantasies all of the time. it seems to me more and more likely that it's going to be the hard rules of physics that will kick in. That some fantasies simply become impossible, unmanufacturable. More than that as your brain enters into fantasy, it's not a particularly good or happy place. Back in the day, 40 years ago nearly, not quite, when I was at Cambridge, I was always amazed at the rich fantasists that ran the place. The way that it changed their minds. It was, you see, things like the Cambridge Union were run by people who were busy mincing around saying, look at me, I'm in the Cambridge Union. That means I'm important and powerful. That means I matter, and I will matter. And they were all consumed with their own belief in their own mattering and sat there patting each other on the back. And the real problem with that was not that anything ever burst their bubble, but rather that their bubble burst our society. Because that self-congratulation at the end of the 80s of a certain right-wing group that they were going to be in perpetual power and dominate the way the discourse worked became our very, very dark world. So fantasism not only hits reality hard, but sometimes it makes reality to conform to its fantasy, and what you then get is a botched society. One that is actually incapable of listening, the world we currently live in, where a certain sort of economic truth is simply accepted and cannot be challenged, in spite of the fact now, like God, most of the population would gladly see the back of it and loathe the idea of the free market and all that other jazz. But the old Cambridge classes, the old fantasist classes, aren't capable of dreaming another fantasy. And so what does it mean then to live in a world where we democratize fantasies, where we get endless sets of these bubbles? Well, they won't necessarily be as powerful as the Cambridge elite that forced our society in one particular direction, but rather will be forever being caught up with other fantastical bubbles in fights where they each accuse each other of lying. It creates a very distorted, complicated set of moves, a very complicated, distorted and complicated set of pieces, perhaps, in a great game of chess, that is very likely to destabilize everything and be very hard to live within. And all the while the physics kicks in about what the world is doing. That somebody is a fantasist is absolutely never something to condemn them for, under any circumstance. There, but for the grace of God, go us all. No, there, under the grace of God, are we all. The problem is, what does one do when one starts to demand that that fantasy is respected? How do you ensure that people respect it? Traditionally, this problem hasn't existed for most of us, because for those people who are allowed to be thick and still in power were the very small minority. Those people who are allowed to live their fantasy was a vanishingly small part. But the entire point of AI is that it connives with you and says your fantasy is possible. And so we live in a great what then? What does that actually mean, to live in a world where our fantasies are meant to be possible? Are they possible? Certainly not. How will they relate to other people's fantasies? Uncomfortably. How will they relate to other people's debunking? Oh, abysmally. None of this works well. None of this is best use of technology out of interest. None of it is a world that any of us would choose to live in. And yet we seem to be incapable of fantasizing another.